Welcome to the Edmonton Organic Growers Guild garden safety video. In this video, we will review the common garden task hazards, environmental hazard, first aid in emergency, and how you can arrive prepared when you come to your shift. First of all, our common garden task hazards and how to avoid them. First thing, seeding, weeding, and harvesting. This is the majority of the work we do at the garden. There are 4 main hazards that you may encounter in these activities. First, soil bacteria, static positions, straining, sharps, and thorns. Soil bacteria exists in all the dirt. It's just what's there. It's part of the natural life cycle that's underneath the ground. The idea is if you have cuts or if you want to avoid cuts, you should wear garden gloves. There's bacteria like E. coli that live in the dirt naturally, so just avoid infection and wear some gloves when you're doing activity digging in the dirt. Also, static positions, when you're weeding or you're planting or seeding, you can be bent over or in an awkward position for a long time. The best solution to avoid back pain is probably just to kneel, change your position often, stretch, and potentially use knee pads or a garden seat if you're feeling like you're getting uncomfortable. Move around, that's the key. As well, you can strain potentially and hurt your back, twist or tweak a muscle. So the first thing to do is to stretch or warm up before you do any weeding. Try not to reach further if you're weeding or planting something, and move closer to the location of the plant or where you want it to be or where you want to pull it out from. And rather than just yanking, some of the plants have some pretty sturdy roots. Try using a digging tool like a fork or a shovel or a hand spade to get out those pesky plants. And with harvesting, you can have some challenging carrots and things to get out of the ground. So rather than pull your back, just use a digging tool. As well, we have sharps and thorns are a risk. So there's stakes that we put at the end of the row markers, and they can have bits of wood sticking out from them. You could get a splinter. If you pull thistles or other weeds that have spines on them, you can get pricked. So the best solution for that is to wear a thicker quality leather palmed or pleather palmed glove, some sort of work glove, and that'll make it so that you don't get a splinter or some sort of spine into your hand. As well, it's a good idea with thistles to pull down from the root level, and that will ensure the plant comes out of the ground, but also that's where there's less spines on the plant. The next activity we do at the garden commonly is digging and shoveling. So just a note that at the garden, we're pretty safe to go down 12 to 18 inches, but anything below that, like if we have heavy machinery that needs to dig out topsoil or something like that, we should really click before we dig and get line locates done before we do any major projects. But the activities listed here are not those types of digs. It's more just digging to plant, to make some small rows and trenches, and to dig in potatoes and that sort of thing. So to avoid foot pain, overworking, straining, stabs, and blisters, your best bet is to get some thick-soled shoes, especially for foot pain, and to use a shovel with a rolled step on the top of it, and that'll make it so that when you push down on the shovel, it's not digging into your foot. As well, if you want to avoid overworking, that means like being exhausted, make sure you take breaks. This is a volunteer activity, so it's meant to be enjoyable and not to make you tired for the rest of the week. So slow down, maintain a sustainable pace, no more than 15 scoops a minute if you're digging compost, and choose the right shovel for the job. So jobs where you have to dig compost that's really dry and loose, or sand, you can use a rounded shovel with a long handle. That's a little bit more ergonomic. And that way you can sort of launch or toss the compost to spread it across a space. The longer handle will make that easier. If you have some heavy wet compost or something that's a little bit, you can still scoop, but is heavier in weight, you want to choose a square bladed shovel with a short handle that you can have it stay close to your body when you move it, and that you can use your hips to push the handle and to push the soil or the blade into the soil. And then when you're digging against hard earth and clay, you want to use a sharpened spade. So that's something that can dig into the ground more easily. So choose the right shovel for the job. As well, to avoid straining, you want to warm up and stretch. Pivot when you're moving the soil or whatever is on your shovel. Don't twist from your waist because that could tweak your side or your back or a muscle. So it's just twisting on the balls of your feet. Try to choose small shovels full. It's not a competition if you do multiple shovels versus, really big shovels. It's just important that the soil gets moved, not that you hurt yourself. And then again, when you're digging into deep soil, like this fellow in the picture, if you want to move the soil, use a rowing motion. So imagine a rowing machine, and that means using your full body to move the handle back and forth as you're digging rather than just using your back or your arms. To avoid stabbing yourself in the foot with a fork, it's a good idea to place your shovel or your fork directly on the dirt and then to step on it rather than to stab down at it. So it's not a race, it's not a rush. If you take your time, it's okay. And then lastly, blisters are a risk. So it's a good idea to have some decent gloves that have good grips on them to prevent your hands from slipping and causing blisters. All right, the next activity that we tend to do is lifting and hauling. So that might be using a wheelbarrow, it might be moving some hoses that are heavy, it might be lifting water jugs, it might be moving some pails. So the hazards that you face in doing these activities are muscle strain, being pinched or crushed for your fingers or toes, exhaustion, trips and falls, and broken equipment. So to avoid muscle strain, keep your loads manageable. Don't overestimate your ability and what you can lift. It's okay not to lift something if you're not comfortable or to ask for help and get someone else to come in to double team on a heavy load. Make sure you pivot your feet similar to the shoveling directive and don't twist when you're moving and hauling. Especially lifting boxes or things like that need to move from one area to another. It's best just to rotate your whole body rather than just your back. If you need to pick up something heavy like a pumpkin or something low to the ground, make sure to lift with your knees and not your back. So that might require a deep knee bend, but you want to keep your back straight. If you're lifting something and your load isn't very secure, maybe you're working with someone else and there's a risk that you could drop the load, make sure to keep your toes and fingers out of harm's way. And you can do that by thinking about gravity and the path of travel that the load would go if it slips and where it would go. So if you have your hands directly underneath an object on top of a shelf and it slips, then your fingers could be crushed. That's something you want to avoid. So maybe you can grab from the side. Exhaustion. So to avoid exhaustion, just take breaks. Stop when you get tired, hydrate, and choose the right tool. So we have wheelbarrows on site. There's no need to haul heavy buckets or watering jugs all the way across a field. Use something like a cart to get the heavy items across the field. If you feel like you can't do the job yourself, as mentioned before, get some help. Slips and trips and falls are a risk at the garden. There's uneven surfaces. There may be tools inadvertently left somewhere, objects. So just pay attention. Keep your mind on the task that you're doing. Try not to daydream and look ahead of you and the path of travel where you're going to go. Ideally, pay attention before you go on that path of travel and walk it ahead of time. Then, if you notice any pits or any open spots, flag it or at least mentally note it and go around. And then, of course, wear good walking shoes or boots. It's very important when you're at the garden not to be wearing flip-flops or other things that in and of themselves can cause tripping hazards. Then, of course, broken equipment. We have had equipment where people get enthusiastic and they overload our wheelbarrows or they overload a cart and then the cart breaks. So to save your own back from having to haul that heavy equipment and to save the equipment itself from wearing out sooner than it needs to, your best bet is not to overload your equipment and take multiple trips rather than just one. Next activity that we tend to do is mowing and rototilling. So this type of equipment is noisy and can cause debris to fly all over the place. So the best bet, like in this picture, this fellow's got his shorts on, but he's got good boots. We want to wear PPE. So safety glasses, you might have rocks that spit out from behind your lawnmower or rototiller. Long pants can be helpful to protect you from anything coming at you. Closed-toed footwear can protect you from stepping on anything that shouldn't be there, and wearing gloves is a good idea to keep your grip, especially on the rototillers that can be hard to keep in control. Now, hearing damage is also something that can happen over time. In an outdoor space, it even is still loud when, especially walking behind a rototiller, if it takes an hour or two to clear and rototill a field. So your best bet is to get some hearing protection, whether that is ear plugs that you would put in your ears or ear muffs. We should have some ear muffs, but it's also a good idea to get your own. Now, there are a couple other garden dangers didn't fit in the categories I had above that I still felt were significant enough to mention. So slips and trips, as mentioned, we want to protect each other, not only ourselves. So it's a good idea to put away hoses, rakes, shovels, and other items that could pose a tripping hazard or danger, and put it away immediately after use. Pay attention to the task at hand as you're walking around and your surroundings, as mentioned before, when you're hauling things. But, it's not always when you're hauling things. It could be when you're just walking around the garden and visiting. So just pay attention as you go. At the end of a shift, if you have been digging, make sure that you backfill any holes or trenches if possible. And if not possible, flag those areas or trenches if you're deliberately leaving them open before you leave your shift. Next as well, we have heavy equipment, fatalities, and major injuries. Thankfully at EOGG, we have not had any of these incidents occur, but in the commercial industry, that happens regularly, which is a kind of scary thought. At EOGG, our solution is to keep all of our volunteers away from heavy equipment if possible. So your job as a volunteer is, if you see a tractor in the field, you see a skid steer, keep away from it. It's not your role to be a spotter. It's not your role to interact with that machine. So stay away. We have the skid steer and the tractor are the two main heavy equipment machinery that we have on our garden plots. If you're there and the skid steer or the tractor is working, we have 4 fields. So feel free to go to a different field and you can still do your work for the day. Similarly, our heavy equipment operators are expected to do the work outside large group shift hours. So hopefully you won't interact with these big machines. Now, the next type of hazard that we want to note is environmental hazards and how we want to avoid them. So the first is sun and hot weather. So heat exhaustion and sunburn are the main risks that we face when we're outside all day in the garden having a good time. So you want to make sure that you take frequent breaks in the shade, drink lots of water, and watch for symptoms of heat exhaustion like nausea, confusion, lightheadedness, or if you've stopped sweating. Excessive sweating can be a first sign, but once you've stopped sweating, that's a big flag. As well, sunburns are a risk, and nobody likes to have peeling skin. It can be a leading cause of cancer. So your best bet is to wear sunscreen, wear a wide-brimmed hat, and if you're not a fan of sunscreen, at least cover up with long sleeves and long pants. The next risk we see, an environmental hazard, is insects, so bees, wasps, and mosquitoes. If you know that you have an allergic reaction to bees or wasp stings, your best bet is to bring your own EpiPen. Please note around before you're digging or you're going into plants, pay attention to what's going on. Are there bees floating around in the flowers of the perennial garden? Maybe don't walk directly through the perennial garden at that time. If you are about to dig into an area that hasn't been dug into before, just pay attention, see if maybe there's an underground nest of wasps. That's the best way to avoid getting stung, is not to rile up the bugs. But also, if somebody else has already previously identified a nest, we should do a good job of communicating and making sure that we all stay away from the nest. As well, there's a possibility of mosquitoes. On wetter seasons, we can see these pests flying at us, and it can be really, really annoying. Thankfully, in Alberta, we don't have a lot of disease when it comes to mosquitoes, but we should still wear insect repellent. There are more commonly, we're starting to see in the last 5 years, ticks in Alberta and in the Edmonton River Valley. So we probably should be safe from ticks on the garden and in the farm, but there are wildlife animals that do at night, like deer and coyotes, that walk through our bushes and our plants. So there is, a limited possibility there could be ticks as well. And they might have Lyme disease or something like that. So your best bet is to wear insect repellent, cover up with long sleeves and pants to avoid that. And if you're worried about it, do a tick check at the end of your garden shift, which just means looking at the folds of underneath where your skin is exposed, maybe having a shower after each of your shifts, and that way you can check and make sure you don't have any ticks. And then the last risk that we might see with the environmental hazard is inclement weather and high winds. So if you're on site and the wind picks up, it's a good idea to secure any light objects like pails and buckets under heavy weights into a space that's not windy. The reason behind that is you don't want something to fly and hit someone. Also, we have lightning strikes. If there's a thunderstorm that's in the forecast, likely we'll cancel the shift, but pay attention to the weather. And before your shift starts, just don't come to the garden if it looks like there's going to be a thunder shower, or pay attention to notifications coming out of your email or your text if you signed up for a shift. As well, if it starts raining while you're on site, you can get wet and cold. So the ground might get muddy, so take care not to slip and fall, and just go home. The idea here is that volunteering should be fun, so just go home if it's not enjoyable because the weather makes it miserable. Now, the next section here, we're going to talk about what to do in case of emergencies and where we might find first aid equipment. So in case of emergency, just be aware that EOGG does not track and supply first aid training. So the Foot Field, which is neighboring to Field 2 or the Saville Center, they should have first aid trained employees within those buildings. But if it is an emergency, secure yourself and others from danger, and then call 911 for immediate medical aid. We do have first aid kits if it's a minor injury like a cut or a scrape. Make sure you disinfect the wound with like an alcohol wipe, wash your hands. We do have 2 kits in the sheds, so Field 2 and Field 5 have sheds, but EpiPens are not part of that kit. So that should be stuff for Band-Aids, basic gauze, that sort of thing. But if you need a AED, unfortunately we don't have AEDs in our sheds. The Foot Field and Saville Center as well should have AEDs on site, and they should also have first aid kits there as well. So please tell us if you use any of our supplies or if you have an injury while working on site, just so we can keep track of that and reload the first aid kit so that we're not missing anything if another injury occurs. And then the last section here is arrive prepared. So this is a pretty basic idea, but before you come to the garden, you should have your gardening kit. So what that involves is the things you should put on before you come. So look at the weather and choose garden and weather appropriate clothing, like maybe long sleeves, pants, jacket if it's going to be a cool day, or something light if it's going to be a really hot day. Bring closed-toed shoes, put on sunscreen, bring your sunglasses and put them on, and a nice wide-brimmed hat. As well, you want to bring with you 2 kinds of gloves depending on the work you're going to do, maybe lighter gardening gloves for planting or weeding, and heavier duty gloves if you're going to be doing some sort of lifting or hauling or digging. If you are allergic to bees, again, bring your EpiPen, make sure you have a snack, some water, bug repellent, and any personal protective equipment if you plan on using machinery like the rototiller or the lawnmower, like ear protection and eye protection. Finally, thank you so much for volunteering at EOGG. We'll hope to see you there. Stay safe.